to force fraud or coercion relating to sex trafficking. So that's kind of what the argument is here. The defense is saying these are just bad acts witnesses. We call them bad acts witnesses because
in a shocking courtroom bombshell, the judge abruptly rejected Sean Diddy Combs' testimony, leaving the courtroom in stunned uproar. What was supposed to be a pivotal moment for the defense instantly unraveled, turning the trial upside down. Emotions ran high as the stakes skyrocketed. This case just got a whole lot more intense. Here's what triggered the explosive courtroom chaos. U.S. District Judge Aaron Subramanian is expected to deliver a pivotal ruling today that could significantly influence the trajectory of Sean Diddy Combs' high-profile federal trial on sex trafficking and racketeering charges. The decision, eagerly anticipated by legal analysts and media observers alike, centers on whether the jury will be permitted to hear a set of explosive allegations leveled by singer and former Diddy Kane member Dawn Richard. Her testimony, if allowed, could broaden the scope of the case and deepen the public understanding of the alleged abuse network tied to the embattled music mogul. Dawn Richard, a longtime figure in the bad boy entertainment orbit, was called to the stand immediately following the departure of Cassie Ventura, Combs' former girlfriend and the central witness in the government's case, who testified extensively last week. Ventura's emotional and graphic accounts have already set a stark tone for the proceedings, painting a picture of systemic abuse, coercion, and exploitation within Combs' inner circle. Richard's pending testimony is said to echo similar themes, while adding new claims that could support the government's assertion of an organized, long-running criminal enterprise allegedly orchestrated by Combs. Judge Subramanian's ruling will determine whether the jury can consider Richard's statements as part of a broader pattern of behavior rather than as isolated incidents. Legal experts note that allowing her testimony could bolster the prosecution's RICO charges by illustrating a sustained and coordinated effort to manipulate, silence, and control individuals within Combs' professional and personal life. On the other hand, the defense argues that Richard's experiences are either irrelevant or prejudicial, claiming they fall outside the temporal and factual bounds of the current indictment. The courtroom has been on edge since Ventura's testimony concluded, with supporters, reporters, and members of the public awaiting the next chapter in what is shaping up to be one of the most consequential celebrity criminal trials in recent memory. Judge Subramanian's decision today could serve as a legal turning point, either narrowing the focus to the specific charges already laid out or opening the door to a much wider narrative, one that could link years of alleged misconduct under a single damning umbrella. Reportedly, attorneys for Sean Diddy Combs are mounting a vigorous effort to exclude a particularly dramatic portion of Dawn Richard's anticipated testimony, an allegation that, in 2009, Combs flew into a violent rage and attempted to strike Cassie Ventura with a hot skillet in a kitchen confrontation over a delayed breakfast. The defense team contends that this account, which has never before surfaced in court filings, is not only irrelevant to the specific sex trafficking and racketeering charges Combs currently faces, but is also dangerously prejudicial and emotionally charged. They argue that its inclusion would unfairly sway the jury by invoking outrage and sympathy rather than aiding in the impartial evaluation of the evidence. According to court documents and pretrial motions, Richard claims that she witnessed the altercation in Combs' Los Angeles residence, where an enraged Combs allegedly berated Ventura for not preparing his eggs on time, culminating in a moment where he raised a heated skillet as if to strike her. The defense calls the episode a theatrical fabrication, noting that Ventura never alluded to such an incident during her extensive time on the witness stand last week. They also highlight that the allegation first surfaced well over a decade after it allegedly occurred, and only after Richard's own relationship with Combs fractured amid contentious financial and creative disputes regarding her solo music career. The defense's position is rooted in the legal principle of relevance versus prejudice, a balancing act that trial judges must often perform in emotionally charged cases. Combs's attorneys maintain that Richard's skillet story lacks any direct connection to the core criminal charges, namely, orchestrating a sex trafficking network and engaging in racketeering, and that it risks inflaming jurors' emotions without offering meaningful probative value. They also suggest the timing of the testimony raises credibility issues, pointing to the long silence surrounding the incident and implying that Richard may be motivated by personal resentment rather than a commitment to truth. On the other side, prosecutors argue that the incident, while not part of the formal indictment, provides crucial insight into Combs's alleged pattern of psychological and physical dominance over women in his orbit. They assert that such behavior reinforces the government's central theory, that Combs maintained control over his associates through fear, intimidation, and violence, thereby establishing the power dynamic necessary for the sex trafficking charges to hold weight. To them, the skillet incident is not an irrelevant side note, but a flashpoint that exemplifies the volatile environment in which Ventura and others allegedly lived for years. Why does Judge Subramanian's upcoming ruling matter so much? Because it strikes at the heart of how jurors will be allowed to interpret the larger narrative of Sean Diddy Combs's alleged conduct. Whether his interactions with women in his inner circle were part of a violent, coercive criminal enterprise or merely isolated, unproven claims lacking legal weight. If the judge grants the defense motion to exclude Dawn Richards' vivid account of the so-called skillet and eggs incident, jurors will be barred from considering one of the most emotionally jarring anecdotes offered thus far, an event that federal prosecutors argue is emblematic of the fear and power dynamics that allegedly defined Combs's relationship with Cassie Ventura and other women. The defense insists that the episode is too inflammatory and unrelated to the specific criminal charges to be legally admissible, but prosecutors argue otherwise. For them, the kitchen altercation, during which Richard claims Combs became so enraged over a delayed breakfast that he beat Ventura as she curled into a fetal position on the floor, only to perform symbolic damage control the next day by distributing flowers, is not just a moment of domestic violence, it's a window into the mechanisms of control, fear, and performative charm that they say Combs used to trap and manipulate women. It fits, they argue, into a broader pattern of psychological conditioning that made it nearly impossible for Ventura to leave the relationship and for others to speak up. This ruling will define not just what evidence the jury hears, but how they're allowed to understand the nature of Combs's influence. If the judge sides with the defense, prosecutors will lose a key building block in their attempt to show that Combs's alleged sex trafficking operation relied on a systemic pattern of abuse rather than isolated wrongdoings. It would also mean jurors are left without critical third-party corroboration of Ventura's more disturbing claims, support that could otherwise lend her testimony added credibility. Richard is one of the few insiders who claims to have directly witnessed acts of violence and then later confronted Combs through legal channels, having previously sued him over unpaid royalties from her work as part of Danity Kane. Moreover, the potential exclusion of this testimony would likely shape public perception of the trial, where Combs's reputation is already under intense scrutiny amid a series of civil suits, federal raids, and explosive media reports. The skillet incident, while seemingly minor in the grand scheme of racketeering and trafficking charges, has quickly become symbolic, a moment that encapsulates the intimate violence prosecutors say operated beneath the surface of Combs's glamorous public persona. If jurors aren't allowed to hear it, they may not grasp the full context of the prosecution's argument, that Combs didn't merely exploit power, he weaponized it in deeply personal and violent ways. At the center of this legal battle is Federal Rule of Evidence 403, a cornerstone of courtroom procedure that gives judges broad discretion to exclude otherwise relevant evidence if its probative value is substantially outweighed by the risk of unfair prejudice, confusing the issues, misleading the jury, or causing undue delay. This rule often becomes the battleground in high-stakes trials involving emotional or explosive allegations, and it is precisely where Combs's legal team has drawn their line. They argue that Dawn Richards' dramatic account of the skillet and eggs episode, in which Combs allegedly tried to strike Cassie Ventura with a hot pan during a 2009 kitchen meltdown, meets every criterion for exclusion. In their view, the story is not only uncharged conduct that falls outside the timeline of the indictment, but is so sensational in nature that it would inflame jurors' emotions and distract from the actual criminal counts at hand. The defense further contends that the story lacks sufficient corroboration to justify its admission. Ventura herself, they emphasize, never mentioned the alleged incident during her recent multi-day testimony, despite providing vivid detail about other moments of abuse. To them, that silence is telling. Combined with the fact that Richard did not publicly raise the claim until years later, and only after her professional relationship with Combs had deteriorated into legal conflict, they argue the account is too unreliable to be given weight. If the goal of Rule 403 is to keep trials focused on clear, probative facts rather than speculation or character assassination, then the defense argues this anecdote must be barred. But prosecutors push back, insisting the defense is misapplying the rule and ignoring the realities of trauma and domestic abuse. It is common, they argue, for survivors to omit or suppress deeply traumatic experiences, particularly those that may seem small or difficult to explain in isolation. They assert that just because Ventura did not mention this particular incident doesn't mean it didn't happen, especially when another credible witness claims to have seen it unfold. Richard, they note, wasn't just a casual observer. She was a member of Combs's professional entourage, operating within the same insulated and carefully curated world as Ventura. Her testimony, they say, provides essential context into how Combs allegedly wielded control, not just through physical abuse, but through a cycle of intimidation, reward, and public image management. For the government, Richard's account is not just a shocking aside, it's a key puzzle piece in illustrating the culture of dominance that underpinned the alleged criminal enterprise. Rule 403, they argue, is not a license to sanitize the truth, especially when the truth reveals a pattern. They stress that the jury deserves to see how power functioned in Combs's world, not just through contracts and public appearances, but in the private, often volatile interactions that shaped the lives of those around him. Judge Subramanian must now decide whether the skillet incident offers the kind of illumination the law seeks, or whether it risks turning the trial into a sideshow driven more by shock than substance. His ruling will set the tone for how much of the prosecution's broader narrative the jury will be allowed to consider, and how narrowly or expansively the boundaries of admissible evidence will be drawn. Cassie Ventura's 4 days on the witness stand did more than recount disturbing personal experiences. They shaped the emotional core of the trial's opening week, establishing the prosecution's central thesis, that Sean "Diddy" Combs did not simply engage in abusive or erratic behavior, but orchestrated and maintained a violent, manipulative criminal enterprise centered on the trafficking and control of women. Ventura testified in harrowing detail about being coerced into attending and participating in so-called freak-off sex parties, where she says she was drugged, raped, and filmed without her consent. Each attempt to reclaim autonomy, whether by trying to leave the relationship or date someone else, was, according to Ventura, met with terrifying retaliation, including beatings and psychological torment. One particularly chilling moment came when Ventura described Combs's explosive reaction to discovering she was romantically involved with rapper Kid Cudi. She claimed the revelation triggered a violent outburst and threats that left her fearing for Cudi's safety. Prosecutors have signaled they will explore that angle further when Cudi, a high-profile name in his own right, takes the stand, either later today or tomorrow, offering what could be a pivotal moment in the case. His testimony is expected to give jurors an outside perspective on the lengths to which Combs allegedly went to control and punish Ventura even after their relationship began to deteriorate. In the wake of Ventura's exit from the stand, prosecutors have methodically called a sequence of witnesses aimed at reinforcing and corroborating her account, each one adding a new dimension to the prosecution's portrayal of Combs's alleged web of influence, abuse, and fear. First came Carrie Morgan, Ventura's former best friend, who offered her own graphic recollections. Morgan testified that she witnessed Combs choke Ventura with a coat hanger and violently drag her by the hair during a trip to Jamaica, an episode prosecutors say demonstrates a pattern of cruelty extending beyond U.S. borders and into the private corners of Combs's lavish lifestyle. Morgan's account added a layer of eyewitness validation to Ventura's broader claims, particularly in underscoring that the violence was not occasional or exaggerated, but frequent and witnessed by others in Combs's close orbit. Then there was George Kaplan, a former personal assistant to Combs, whose testimony painted an insider's view of the inner workings of the mogul's entourage. Kaplan described the environment as an all-consuming kingdom, a closed ecosystem in which staffers were on constant alert to fulfill Combs's often unpredictable and disturbing demands. According to Kaplan, this included securing hotel suites stocked with sex paraphernalia at short notice, an effort that prosecutors suggest aligns with the logistics of a commercial sex trafficking operation, supporting their claims of premeditation and scale. Next, Special Agent Gerard Gannon of the Department of Homeland Security testified about the items recovered during the 2024 federal raid on Combs's Miami mansion. Among the seized evidence were firearm components including AR-15 parts, large quantities of MDMA and cocaine, and unusually large bottles of baby oil, items prosecutors say are emblematic of a highly organized and deeply exploitative commercial sex ring. The agent's testimony offered a forensic layer to the trial, grounding the case not just in personal narratives, but in tangible material evidence that speaks to preparation, intent, and the means to carry out the alleged crimes. Finally, prosecutors brought in Dr. Dawn Hughes, a nationally recognized forensic psychologist who has consulted on numerous abuse and trafficking cases. Dr. Hughes provided expert testimony explaining how victims of long-term abuse can appear loyal, affectionate, or financially entangled with their abusers, even while experiencing severe psychological and physical harm. Her insights were designed to counter any doubts jurors might have about Ventura's credibility or the seeming contradictions in her behavior over the years. Hughes emphasized that trauma bonding, emotional manipulation, and financial dependency often mask abuse in plain sight, making it harder for victims to recognize, report, or escape their situation. What happens next could significantly alter the trajectory of the trial. On Monday, U.S. District Judge Arun Subramanian made clear that he wanted to proceed carefully before issuing a pivotal ruling that could affect both the scope of admissible testimony and the broader narrative that the jury is allowed to consider. He asked for formal written briefs over the weekend from both sides and heard oral arguments yesterday, signaling that a decision is imminent. At the heart of the matter is whether the jury will be permitted to weigh Dawn Richards' vivid, highly emotional account of Combs allegedly attempting to strike Cassie Ventura with a hot skillet during a 2009 kitchen altercation. If Judge Subramanian rules in favor of the defense, the jury will receive what's known as a curative instruction, explicitly directing them to disregard Richards' testimony about the skillet incident entirely. Legal experts caution, however, that such instructions, while procedurally necessary, often fail to erase the psychological imprint of dramatic, already heard testimony. Jurors may try to comply, but vivid imagery and emotional storytelling tend to linger, especially in a trial so heavily dependent on narrative coherence and personal accounts. In that scenario, the defense would gain a strategic victory. one that might help narrow the jury's focus to officially charged conduct and away from emotionally charged, peripheral stories that could sway jurors unfairly. On the other hand, if Subramanian denies the defense motion, Richard's story becomes officially entrenched in the trial's evidentiary record. Prosecutors would then be free to revisit the skillet incident during closing arguments, using it as a potent example of Combs's alleged pattern of violence and psychological domination. The ruling would effectively validate the prosecution's argument that Richard's testimony, while emotionally provocative, is a critical piece of corroborative evidence showing how Combs maintained control over Ventura through fear and coercion, even in seemingly domestic settings like the kitchen of a private home. In this version of events, the jury could view the skillet incident not as an isolated outburst, but as a microcosm of a larger system of abuse. No matter how the judge rules, today marks a turning point. The government is expected to call Kid Cudi, the Grammy-winning rapper and former friend of Ventura, whose presence has been teased for days as a potential showstopper in the trial. Prosecutors will likely focus on a chilling 2011 incident in which Cudi's Audi exploded outside his New Jersey home, an event that occurred just weeks after Combs allegedly discovered Ventura was romantically involved with the artist, and according to testimony, threatened to blow up that car. The prosecution will argue that the timing and circumstances of the explosion suggest an unambiguous pattern of intimidation, a message to Ventura and perhaps to others in her orbit that associating with her came at a personal risk. The government is expected to suggest this wasn't an idle threat, but an act meant to isolate Ventura by targeting those who might support or protect her. Cudi's testimony, if consistent with the prosecution's theory, could offer rare third-party validation of the fear Combs allegedly instilled in those around Ventura. His celebrity status also brings added media attention and weight to the proceedings, potentially increasing public interest and raising the stakes inside the courtroom. Prosecutors may seize on the opportunity to show that the alleged abuse extended far beyond Ventura's private suffering. It reverberated through her relationships, limiting her personal agency and deepening her dependency on Combs. Yet the defense is poised for an aggressive counterattack. Their cross-examination is expected to focus on the fact that Cudi never publicly accused Combs of any wrongdoing in the aftermath of the explosion. They will press him on whether any evidence directly links Combs to the destruction of the car and may question the timing and motivations of his testimony. The defense strategy will likely aim to portray the incident as an unfortunate coincidence or an unsolved mystery that prosecutors are now retrofitting to suit their narrative. They may also highlight that, in the years since, Cudi has made no legal moves to hold Combs accountable, casting doubt on the prosecution's interpretation of the event. What do you think about the judge considering throwing out testimony at Sean Diddy Combs' trial? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you for watching this and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.